Pardon the interruption. I'm Amy Poppinga. Sam, now that the World Cup is over, what international sport are you going to pretend to be a fan of next?
Cricket, anyone? Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Amy, the first exam is now behind us. So we thought we'd take a moment here just to kind of reflect a little bit. What were your observations on grading that first exam?
First of all, it's you know that you're a geek when you say, I really enjoyed grading your exams, but I really enjoyed grading your exams. Overall, I think the exams went really well, especially with some of the things that we worry about going into the first one that we think may have been issues or that are concerns that you might have. Essays overall looked great. Just a couple points of improvement. We're always looking for the details. We're always looking for the specifics, things that really indicate that you not just have a sense of the big picture, but that you're able to really sort of give us the meat from the content to show that you really kind of know not just the who and the what, but again, that significance, it comes out in your vocabulary connections, but it also comes out in your essays. But overall, I was really pleased. The other thing I would just say is making sure that you manage your time correctly, which is something that it always takes sort of the first essay under your belt to sort of know what you're going to need and how you want to distribute your time effectively to be the most successful. So I would say that overall, writing was great, and that timing is something that you want to work on a little bit or just keep in mind as you move into the next one.
Yeah, the other big observation I had, I would reiterate the time thing, absolutely. The other thing is make sure you read the question carefully.
Yes.
Because I had some people who wrote good, thoughtful answers that were using content, but when you actually looked at what they talked about, they weren't actually addressing what the question was getting at. So I think sometimes, and this is true for any kind of exam you're taking, we get so worked up about the fact that I'm taking an exam and it's timed that you look at the question, you start writing, but you never go back to say, well, okay, what really was this question getting at? Because the fact of the matter is often I find myself grading saying, I think you might know the answer to this, but it's sure not on the paper or on the screen. So that's another big thing to do. Yeah. And I would say in terms of the connection things, it really helps to write in complete sentences. Again, sometimes I think I know what you're saying, but you didn't actually say it. And what I need to grade you on is what you say, not what I think you're trying to say.
And while you don't have to give a massive amount of background information, you do need to keep in mind that you also can't write from a place of making assumptions about what one already knows. So you kind of have to make it explicit what you're saying, kind of even pretending a little bit that the person grading it may not have all of the same information that you have, so that your writing is just really clear. Sam, can you, one of the things moving forward, thinking about the next unit that students have already sort of been dipping their toes into, is that one of the big concepts that we cover are these different types of law. And that's something that we're going to continue to engage as we move forward. One of the things that students tend to struggle with a little bit is having a sense of being able to differentiate between natural law and divine law. Can you offer any pointers, or how would you help them out?
Absolutely, and I think the key to understanding this is going to be a big theme for a couple of different things we talk about today, which is hierarchy. Right? If you want to understand the Middle Ages, you want to think hierarchically, and that means sort of a top-down understanding. So when we talk about natural law versus divine law, this is coming out of that Thomas Aquinas reading. So we want to think about, Aquinas is thinking about law hierarchically. So he's going to start at the top actually with what he calls eternal law. And the way to think about that is that's sort of like the mind of God, right? That's the totality of God's law. And then there are subsets under that, and there are two different types of law that falls under that. The first is natural law. A big idea for Aquinas is that he thinks we can do a lot with just reason. Aquinas is a Christian, right? And he's writing to Christians essentially, right? That's who's going to be the audience for what he's writing. He's saying we can do a lot with just our reason alone. So what he says is natural law are the legal principles we can come up with that we only need our reason, and then the world around us, right? He says because we learn those things through nature, through the natural world. Who created the natural world? God. So he's saying we're learning those things from God, but it's through what he calls general revelation, right? Things that God reveals to us generally, to everyone. So he would say Aristotle, who Aquinas is a big fan of, Aristotle has access to all of that general revelation stuff, right? So he's saying there are some legal principles just by looking at the world, using our reason, we can come up with. And he calls those things natural laws. So we think about, like, what are examples of natural law? Well, something like human life has value, right? Obviously in the Ten Commandments it says, thou shalt not kill, but there's lots of societies not based on Judeo-Christian ethics that say human life has value, right? So the natural world tells us that. So that's a natural law. Human life has value. You shouldn't murder. You should do things that help preserve life. Underneath natural law, Aquinas says that there's something called human law, right? And human law is our attempts as human beings to apply natural law to specific situations. I'll give you an example. Natural law would tell us that it's not safe to drive your car as fast as you can at all times, right? Because what's that going to result in?
An accident.
An accident. And that's going to result potentially in death. Human life has value, right? Natural law. We're not using scripture or anything to come to that. Human law is us taking that idea and applying it to a specific situation. Like around this really sharp turn, the speed limit is 25 miles an hour, right? That's us applying natural law or applying natural law to a specific situation. So those are natural law principles. Then Aquinas says there are things we know through natural law, but then there are some things that God teaches us that we're never going to get to just by using our reason. And he says those things are divine law. They're revealed to us not through nature generally, but they're revealed to us through special revelation, the scriptures. So if we think about principles that Christ teaches that seem to go against reason, like, love your neighbors. That seems like a natural law principle. Love your enemies. That seems like it goes against natural law. That seems like, why would you love your enemies, right? Well, but that's what Christ teaches, right? So we need scripture to teach us that. And Aquinas' idea is that there's this hierarchy of law, and if we want to have a complete understanding of law, we need to combine natural law, what God teaches us through the world, with divine law, what God teaches us through the scriptures, right? So there's this hierarchical understanding. So our faith in scripture and what scripture teaches us perfects the work that reason began and gives us a totality of law. So it's a hierarchical understanding, and it's thinking about those two things together. Whenever you look at Aquinas, you're going to see him bringing those types of things together. If we're thinking about hierarchy in the Middle Ages, there's another set of hierarchies, kind of social, political hierarchies that we run into a lot, and that's feudalism and manorialism. And these are things which students tend to struggle with either understanding or trying to figure out how they connect, but also how they're distinct. How does that work?
Well, both of these, one of the challenges of understanding feudalism and manorialism, and I think part of why they get confused is because you're sort of dealing with the same people set up in hierarchies, but each system is serving a different function within society. So let's start out with manorialism. So manorialism you can think of as a sort of an economic structure that provides security. And it provides security not only an actual physical security, because as people have sort of moved away from cities with the fall of the Roman Empire, you want to stick together. You want to be able to have your family be protected. And one of the ways to do that is to sort of stick within the system. And so within the system of manorialism, the majority of society would live on a large manor. And there are pictures of this in your Bachman text, as well as if you even just were to do a search on the internet. So if you're a visual learner, I think that can be a really helpful way to begin to understand it. But on the manor, you typically had the lord, who was the owner, essentially, of the manor. And then you have peasants who are underneath the lord, who work the land in exchange for the protection of the Lord, and also they are able to keep some of the food that they produce. So you might work out in the fields all day long, and a certain portion of what you produce you're going to get to keep yourself. You have to give the rest of it to the Lord. In exchange for doing this work, you have housing provided to you, you have that security that is provided to you, you're able to use the mill, you're able to use the other resources available. So it provides a level of stability. Now, you don't try to move out of this, so you wouldn't say, well, we're going to save our money in a couple of years, we're going to buy our own manor. You would not be able to do that. You didn't really challenge the hierarchy. One, it wouldn't be smart from a political perspective, but also you simply would not have the means to do so. Life is really about day-to-day survival, and you are concerned with just making it through the day, staying safe, and being fed. So in this system of manorialism, it is you certainly, as a peasant, which the majority of society would be, you're at the lowest sort of rung of the ladder, if we want to think about it that way. But at the same time, your daily needs are being met. And at this point in history, with all of the instability, that really is what you're most concerned with. Then we have feudalism. And if you want to kind of think about it, let's have feudalism be something that we just kind of lay over manorialism, because these are two systems that work together. So we're not going to contrast them or see them as separate. Rather, we're going to put them as sort of layers over one another. Feudalism is the political hierarchy. So we have the king at the top. Underneath the king, we are going to have the lords. We have knights who offer their protection and service to the lords, and in return, they are given power and authority, and they are often given land and try to expand their own their own ownership of property. They pledge that loyalty back, and they are who keep everyone safe. So again, you want to sort of stay within both of these systems. You want to stay within it in order to be protected. Students, something that you're going to be doing is another discussion post, which I think we've come to really enjoy and kind of hear from you and have different voices and have conversation going back and forth a little bit. And so for our next discussion post, we are going to be talking about what can we as Christians in the 21st century learn from our studies of Christianity during the medieval period. So what we're really interested in is to sort of explore, as you particularly have looked at these different approaches to Christianity that you have seen, what's appealing about it, what troubles you, but is there anything that can kind of offer us inspiration that we think, gosh, there's really a lesson to be learned here that can either provide a sense of conviction or a sense of inspiration for the way that you're approaching your faith today?
Well, and I think what's interesting is, I mean, if you're not familiar with the history that we're telling here, you might be looking at Christianity in the Middle Ages and thinking, how do we get from there to what my church looks like today,
Yes.
right? Because they probably look, even if you're a Roman Catholic, because that's the tradition I grew up in, they look radically different still. Like the Roman Catholic Church today does not look like the medieval Catholic Church. So I think it's interesting to think, the story we're going to be telling in the second half of this unit is the beginnings of what happened. How does the church change in lots of ways, especially through the Protestant Reformation? But I think what this question is, before we move on to that, to say, well, as you look at that faith, like what was lost? What is the thing that you wish was maybe part of our expressions of faith? And that's really the kind of thing that we're really interested in hearing you talk about.
Yeah, and you can think about how the role of sort of individual faith versus community faith, how you saw those two things at work in the medieval period and how you kind of think about those today. We will put some structure around the question, but we also want you to feel free to kind of take off in a direction that you find particularly interesting so that we can have better discussion.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was exciting with our last discussion. We didn't tell you have to go read what other people wrote, but clearly people were, and I think that's great. And if you want to base your comments sort of off of what somebody else had written about and expand on that or contrast that or question that and bring up something else, that's great. I think any time you can engage not only with us but also other people on the boards, that's really fantastic.
No, that's great. And I think that this is actually an appropriate place to just make a note about comments. We really try to give you quite a bit of feedback on both your exams as well as your daily written assignments, the museum worksheets. We really want you to read those comments. Make sure that you email us, contact us if you have questions and you don't quite understand what we ask. But we really enjoy the back and forth communication with you. So the discussion boards are a good place to kind of practice that. And at the same time, we want to make you aware of to just kind of keep in mind reading the comments that we offer you on your assignment.
Well, Amy, the viewers have answered the call. We have our first We Got Your Backman photos.
Excellent.
Right, so the first is from McKenna Young, photo she took in Hayward, Wisconsin, right, out by the lake, sitting on the dock, so you can see that here.
Yes. Lovely.
That's right. And then our second photo is also taken in Wisconsin. This is I spent the 4th of July weekend up at our family's cabin outside of Eagle River, Wisconsin. So this is Backman at Stormy Lake.
Wow, also lovely. Cultures of the West is taking Wisconsin by storm.
That's right. But where else is it taken by storm? We need more photos.
We do. We need more photos. Send us your photos. Feel free to get creative with them. We know that Backman is heavy. The next edition comes with a handle, so you'll have missed out on that. But for sure, send those to us. We really enjoy it.
All right, and we'll be back in segment 2 to talk a little bit about Islam.
All right.
Okay, we're back for segment 2. I've stepped in place of Sam. I'm Chris Gehrz. I've been away for like 5 minutes now. You
Yes.
know who I am. I didn't need to say that. Amy, it's good to have you back.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I was off enjoying the 4th of July holiday week in Alexandria, Minnesota.
Okay.
Also, well, not in Wisconsin, obviously, but also on a lake, on a dock. So, but I am back. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't want to say anything when Sam was here, but I think things slipped last week, so I'm glad you're here.
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't always play games in the second segment. Occasionally we break it down and get a little bit more serious and talk about one topic in more depth. I know you wanted to talk about my haircut
I
for
did,
5 good minutes.
very
but
much.
I said, no, we have an
Yes.
Islamic scholar here, a specialist in Islamic
Yes.
studies. Let's talk about Islam some more. So you've actually seen a lot about Islam in the past couple of films, the origins, all the way up through probably a little bit about the fall of Constantinople, at least a couple of the paths in the museum, both the intellectual path and, of course, the Crusader path, have a lot to say about Islam. So I don't really want to spend that much time on kind of the deep history of Islam, more about your interest in it,
Sure.
and then bring it up into the present day. So if we could start with just a little bit of intellectual autobiography. Amy, why do you study Islam? What draws you to that field?
Yeah, I did not grow up with a lot of knowledge about other religions. I grew up in a predominantly Christian environment, Christian community. To me, there were two categories of people. There were people that believed in God and believed in God the way that I did, and then in God, one God, creator God, and then there were people that didn't. And so those were kind of my only two categories. But then when I was a social studies teacher, I had here in Minnesota, I had a number of students who were Muslim from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. And it was really my first exposure to wanting to know more about Islam, because I realized that this was a religion that very much was something that was going to come into play and be evident throughout the school day. So as opposed to sometimes the American approach in the school system to Christianity, where especially in the late 1990s, and I think even before that, the attitude was sort of religion is something that you need to keep in your car, and then you can re-engage religion at the end of the day. We just religion is contentious, so let's keep it separate. Islam is not conducive to that. Islam is a religion that has requirements of the believer to do throughout the day, and it's not just something that can kind of be compartmentalized. So when I first sort of started to see that there were students who were Muslim and that it created certain challenges for them in terms of just the way that they would navigate the American school day, I became really interested in it. And I was, as a history teacher, I felt like I had some responsibility, I guess, to be informed and to know more about it, and I just really didn't. And so I went back to graduate school to get a master's degree in Islamic studies, and my hope was to teach in the to go back and work in the public school system. We have cultural liaisons here in Minnesota that work with teachers and other staff to just become more aware of the diversity of their student populations. But in the midst of graduate school, September 11th happened, and it kind of changed the course and the direction that I was taking with what I wanted to do. And then I wound up teaching at Bethel. So because we also had at the college level students who now were interested and wanted to know about Islam and the places in the world where Islam is predominantly practiced. And so there was sort of a little bit of a hole to fill, and so I've been fortunate enough to fill that hole a little bit.
So what year did you first come back to teach the Intro to Muslim World course?
So I taught Intro to the Muslim World, which is in the history department, a U course, which is our world cultures category. The first time I taught it was J-term of 2006.
Okay, so you've been teaching this, and then you also have a new course, Muslim Women in History, and also Modern Middle East.
Modern Middle East, which certainly is not just about Islam, but Islam becomes a thread throughout that story.
So over those 7 to 8 years, how have you seen student attitudes or interests, concerns change, stay the same?
Yeah, there's definitely sort of a trajectory to it. And actually, even in class, I will make a timeline and kind of talk to students at the end of the semester about this kind of trajectory of attitudes and interests and knowledge coming in. When I first started, those students, they had been in high school during September 11th. So it was very personal to them, very much a part of sort of their experience. I had students say, that's when I really sort of started to realize that there was a world beyond my community and that it was going to have an impact on me, and that world events were something that, actually do matter and actually can feel very personal. And those students really kind of had an openness, just sort of we don't feel like we know much of anything. And there was just sort of a real sort of spirit of wanting to know. And it was really their first exposure to it. As time went on, especially as America became involved in wars in countries that have predominantly Muslim populations, you saw I don't want to call it a backlash, but you definitely saw sort of more of a little bit of a fatigue. Like, we feel like we've been getting a lot of information about this. We don't necessarily know what's accurate. But at the same time, as you have family members that are in the military, or you have just sort of more awareness of it, and you've seen the impact of these wars on our own country, there definitely was sort of a weariness a little bit, and a little bit of a defensiveness as well. Because I think by this point in time, you'd started to see much more engagement between the Christian community in the United States and the Muslim community. I argue that much of that has been really good and really positive. At the same time, it's also created certain types of tensions, a lot of misinformation that exists. So then I found that I'd have a lot of students who were coming in, and a lot of times the information that they had about Islam, I don't want to blatantly call it inaccurate, but it was definitely sort of skewed in one perspective. So there was often some sort of clearing up to do. And also it was forcing the Christian community to be a little bit more self-reflective. One of the central features of Islam is that it's an Abrahamic faith, which means that it's one one of the 3 traditions that come from the prophet Abraham. So in the theme of hierarchy, I'm going to make a triangle here. And so if we have Abraham here at the top, Judaism, followed by Christianity, followed by Islam, all trace their roots back to Abraham. That was new news to the most of the Christian students that I would teach. And at that point in time, I think there was sort of a resentment of that, because it's threatening. It's threatening to think, wait a minute, I've been doing something one way, and now you're telling me that these people are worshiping the same God, and that can be very unsettling. I would say that now, though, here, so it's 2014, so we're 8 years later, I've almost sort of seen like this shift back to where we were at the beginning, except that people are coming in with more knowledge. And it's not just knowledge, but I think one of the key things that's made my teaching much more enjoyable and enriching is that the knowledge is coming from relationships. So instead of it coming from you were at a seminar, or your church did something, or you read a book, or you saw something on TV, it's I have a friend. I have a friend on the soccer team in particular. I had a friend from student council. We had a Muslim family that lives on our street, or even in rural Minnesota, we have a lot of Muslim communities. So now there's a desire to know and to be critical thinkers, but at the same time, more from a place of, because these are people to me, and these are people in my community. So I think that now is kind of, I felt like this past year was sort of like a sweet spot in terms of there's still this desire to know, there's still a lot of misinformation, but yet we're willing to be a little bit more self-reflective and self-critical, but mainly because it's being driven by that desire to be a good neighbor, which is something that you guys mentioned in the first segment. So
Sure. Maybe to come back to this idea of being self-reflective, because I've heard you talk about this, a couple other professors, Andy Bramson, political science, Craig Heffley in philosophy. You all did something in the library this past spring, where one thing you talked about was how studying Islam in some ways helps you better understand your own faith.
Yes.
So this week we're asking students, what could 21st century Christians learn from medievals? What could 21st century Christians learn from 21st or 7th century Muslims?
I think one of the main things that I feel that I'm personally challenged by, and I always see the students challenged by, and that's one of the things that I really enjoy about teaching Islam, is that the students and I really are we are co-learners, but we're more kind of co-experiencers. That sort of, that experiencer is not a word, but
it is now.
It is now, but that we often are kind of going through all the same emotions together. And so for me, one of the things that the study of Islam has consistently challenged me to do is to know why I have, I know what I believe, but do I know why I believe it? I mean, can I back it up with scripture? And one of the key things I think that this course of CWC shows us is the controversy over, the emphasis on, the importance of knowledge of Scripture and what we think that means. And if we hold Scripture to be this ultimate authority, how well do we actually know it? And so for me, Islam has consistently challenged me to make sure that I know Scripture. If a Muslim says, "Why do you believe this?" And then I say, well, it says it somewhere in the Bible. It's really challenged me to say, where does my scripture back up a particular piece of theology that I hold? Where does scripture inspire me? Where does scripture challenge me, particularly on the idea of what does it mean to be neighbor? And so I have had students sort of consistently respond, gosh, we just don't, when you're the majority, you don't have to always know or have sort of authority behind you, because you give each other the benefit of the doubt when you're the majority. So studying a minority group, putting ourselves in their shoes, really, I think, creates sort of a sense of self-conviction to show us that we want them to know, we want them to be accountable for their actions, or to be able to explain the things within their religion that we don't understand. Are we willing to interrogate ourselves with those same questions? So that's something that a study of Islam challenges me to always say, am I able to answer these same questions for myself? And I think that it's only fair to say that whatever question we're going to ask of another community, we have to be willing to ask it of ourselves.
Sure. Let me do my own "we've got your backman" moment right here. This is a new textbook for us in CWC, and I think one reason we were drawn to it is that it actually says a fair amount about Islam, even though it's a Western Civ textbook. And if you haven't read the introduction, Backman explains that, and he says this is pretty unusual. Usually you get this, maybe a chapter on Muhammad, origins, Crusades, but then all of a sudden the Middle East disappears from the Western narrative. So here's why you say that this book overtly rejects that view, and this is Roman numeral 24 in the introduction. It insists on including the region of the Middle East in the general narrative as a permanently constitutive element of the Greater West. For all its current global appeal, Islam is essentially a Western religion, after all, one that has its spiritual roots in the Jewish and Christian traditions, and the bulk of whose intellectual foundations are in the classical Greco-Roman canon. To treat the Muslim world as an occasional sideshow on the long march to Western Europe and American world leadership is to falsify the record and to get the history wrong. Is that your take on it? I mean, first of all, is Islam a Western religion?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
I agree with everything around that particular sentence. And when I say that, I don't necessarily agree that I would classify Islam as a Western religion, because I think that a lot of Muslims would take issue with that statement. So Islam is a global religion, and so certainly we see the development and the influence of how Islam plays out in Western society and is influenced and shaped by it. I think, though, I like the spirit of what Bachman is saying, which is to say that to act as I used to even say in lecture, which I now reject and have gotten away from. I used to say, well, in other news, or here's what was happening over here. I'm even going to put my hands off because it was way over there. That it was this story that had nothing to do with the greater story that we were telling. That it was a separate story, and I think that actually is something that has come under criticism in a post-September 11th world, because part of the frustration, or part of the sort of the tension that sometimes can exist between not just like a Christian and Muslim community, but rather the Eastern and the Western world, for Muslims who know nothing other than being Muslim in Western societies, is this frustration that you act as if we haven't been here all along. And so I think that Bachman's intention was saying this has been here, this has been a part of it. It's sometimes it's pushing back against the greater culture. Again, it's very much influenced by it. It's actually a really helpful step in now a teaching of Islam to demonstrate to folks that, especially when they ask that question of why do they hate us, that these are not necessarily completely separate categories. So I really like Bachman's intention to say, if we tell this story, and it's not difficult to do, so we don't have to reach far to say, well, let's try to do this in a different way. It's actually, I think, just doing it in an accurate way. It's not new. It's not, like I said, a challenge to have to find the material. It's all there. We just always sort of separated them. But bringing them back together, I think, actually is a really positive step in making the story not only more accurate, but more beneficial to everybody.
And again, it might actually provoke some self-reflection among Christian students. I mean, first of all, Christianity is not a Western religion any more than Islam. I mean, we're focusing on Christianity and Western cultures, so you'll get the idea, well, Christianity is just in Europe, but we've tried to nod at least to the fact that it continues in places like Ethiopia and Syria. And to this day, Christianity is mostly an African, Asian, and Latin American religion. But also, even in the time period, and even with the focus we have, you're going to find Christians who pretty much affirm Western culture. We're in a moment in the Middle Ages here where it's really hard to tell the difference between Christianity and Western culture. Certainly not true of a lot of the first unit, and even I think you'll see by the end of the course, you're going to see some of those tensions emerging where Christians will really have to struggle with, how do I fit into Western culture? Is this a thing whose values I can affirm, transform? We'll use some of that language throughout. It's a little bit easier for Christians in the places we're looking at because they are the majority, and they do have a great deal of power, and so often it's this very abstract question of how do we live in the world but not of it. And if you're of a religious or an ethnic or an economic minority, if you're on the margins, it's a much more pressing living question of what does it mean to live in this culture that I don't really feel fully part of. So this is just a few minutes to dive a little bit deeper. If you want to learn more about this, we do have, I think Bachman really is a good resource for thinking differently about Islam, about the West. I'd really encourage you to look up some of the classes Amy teaches. She mentioned, we've talked about the U course, which U is a category that comes right out of CWC, so you could take Intro to the Muslim World, History 212U. After U comes G courses, and Amy's Muslim Women course is a G course. And if you're interested in a history major or minor, or it also counts as a political science course, take her Modern Middle East course. And then there are others. Philosophy offers at least one or two courses, I think, on Islamic thought as well, and religious studies, that minor would be another way to study that religion. Thanks, Amy. All right, welcome back for our third and final segment in this week's PTI webisode. Sam, let's do happy happies. First of all, a happy birthday to former NFL place kicker Gary Anderson, 55 today. And I'll be honest, he seemed like he was 55 in his playing days. I think so. Right?
Well, I was going to say, if he's 55 today, why is he a former kicker? It seems like
I'm not sure that
just keep going.
I'm not sure that he is, honestly. I just put that down, but I
heard they invited Gary Upremi into camp, so you're never too old.
Sam, it's been 16 plus years since Gary Anderson missed his only kick of the 1998-99 season in the NFC Conference Championship game, and I think we'll all agree the best team in Vikings history failed to go to the Super Bowl. Are you over it yet?
No. I think my son and I were watching an Atlanta Falcons game, and I remember he asked me who I was rooting for, and I just said not the Falcons, and he's like, "Why?" And then he wasn't alive in 1998 for me to, so I'm like, I can't ever like them. I can't ever get over that. The Brett Favre year 2009 was really, really, really tough.
Yeah.
But it was just it was tough because it was reliving 1998 all over again.
Yeah.
I am not over it. Are you?
No, I was living in Connecticut, and I really wasn't paying that much attention to Minnesota sports, but that was the year that caught my attention, and it was kind of crushing. I almost left before the end because I was going to a thing at church, and then I thought, no, I want to see this through to its end, and I kind of regret that I did.
Yeah, I had dropped out of following sports while in college, and that was my senior year, and I'm like, okay, I'm back in, I'm a senior, and then I had my heart literally ripped out of my chest and shown to me. Happy anniversary! The schism between the Western and Eastern churches, which started 960 years ago today.
According to Wikipedia.
That's right. Chris, we barely say anything about the Eastern Orthodox Church in this course. You've got 1 minute to break it all down for us.
Okay, 3 things. First of all, the Eastern Orthodox use vernacular language in worship. So in medieval Western Europe, you've got Latin as the language of the church. In medieval Eastern Europe, if you're in Greece, you use Greek. If you're in Russia, you use Russian. If you're in Bulgaria, you use
Bulgarian?
Gaelic.
Oh,
just kidding.
really?
No, Bulgarian.
Okay, I was gonna say.
Well, and that might sound familiar, and it might make you think there's some continuity with kind of Protestants thinking you should use the language people understand. One thing that's very different, though, number 2 here, is that for the Eastern Orthodox, Augustine is a saint, but he's really not this foundational figure. And in fact, a lot of his philosophical theology is rejected. For example, the Eastern Orthodox don't necessarily believe in original sin, and have a somewhat more optimistic idea of human perfection. They call it divinization, that we actually become more like God over the course of our lives. And then number 3, we talk a lot about Christendom in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, and I think that creates the false idea that church and state are basically the same thing. Yeah, they're separate. They work together, ideally, but they actually fight a lot. In Eastern Orthodox tradition, usually the king is also the head of the church. These are the heirs of Constantine. And so in the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, Justinian the Great is also the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it means they get bound up. It gets there's turmoil because you get these controversies over the use of art in churches, and that's a political issue, not just a religious issue. You see this today in Russia, especially. The Russian Orthodox Church is very close to Vladimir Putin's government, which is uncomfortable certainly for non-Orthodox Christians and others. The other thing, though, to think about is that for a lot of the time period where we're ignoring the Eastern Orthodox, they're living in parts of the world that now are under Islamic control. And so what do you do then if you've got this idea of the role of the state, but non-Christians are your rulers? And in a lot of those places, actually, I think it's fair to say, especially during and after the Crusades, the Eastern Orthodox in some ways prefer their Muslim rulers to, say, a French ruler, an Italian, a Latin-speaking Western European ruler.
How dare you try to sneak that much content into
Was that 1 minute?
Happy
That
time.
felt like 1 minute.
It was about 5, so
Okay.
we're good.
3, happy trails to, we've already said this, but we'll repeat it, the 2014 World Cup, which means we can also say happy trails to me asking questions about soccer. Sam, baseball's All-Star Game will take place about 10 hours after we film this webisode. We're filming on Tuesday. So, again, we can do a prediction in advance. Any thoughts about what's going to happen in the All-Star Game tonight?
I'm looking out the window right now. The weather looks beautiful, not overly hot, so I think that'll be great.
Okay.
So
No one's going to break a sweat.
People won't sweat too much.
Probably not too much cramping.
Yeah. I know very little about the All-Star Game this year.
So Derek Jeter is kind of swan song, I think. Is he going to hit a home run like Cal Ripken
No.
hit a home run?
No.
Is he going to hit like an RBI ground out? Maybe.
I think he's going to almost leg out an infield hit, and then they're gonna make some comments about how he almost legged out an infield hit. That's going to be the moral victory for Mr. Derek Jeter.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. So please do send us your email. We've got your Backman shots. What else are we soliciting email from?
Well, make sure you go on the discussion boards. I mean, that's the big thing.
Yeah. More than that, what do you think the 21st century Christians can learn from our medieval brethren and sisters before?
We're also especially interested in your thoughts on Islam. We spend a big chunk of this webisode talking about that. And it is pretty special that we have someone like Amy both teaching this course and teaching at Bethel, to be able to speak to Islam and to speak to Christianity and the interactions between those. I think that's going to be a growth area within Christianity in the next the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
And honestly, something fairly distinctive about Bethel is an evangelical Christian college. There are a lot of places where it'd be very difficult. It is sometimes difficult to have these conversations, but the fact that we actually have hired people like Amy, I think, is we can probably puff ourselves up a little bit about. We'll do more of this mentioning courses to take as we get closer and closer to the end of the course. So especially if you're a new student just coming into Bethel, or maybe you've just finished your first year and you're thinking about gen ed courses to take. You're also thinking about majors, minors, things like that. We'll build this into webisodes. You'll see it in museums. We'll try to flag these things. So if a topic catches your attention, we'll try to suggest here's where you can learn more about it. Okay, you'll learn more about CWC in our next webisode, but also enjoy. We're going to talk a lot about the Renaissance and Reformation coming up. Sam, how are we going to end this?
By saying goodbye.
Goodbye.